And now I would like to give the floor to the representative of the Arab Republic of Syria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak today as a main party to this item on the agenda. How is it possible for the United Nations, as we are in the 21st century, how is it possible for the UN to accept the continued Israeli occupation that is military, racist, and settler, an occupation that commits the most heinous of crimes and violations and supports terrorism? How is it possible to allow the UN to continue to be a failure in upholding its responsibilities, legal and historic, to end the Israeli occupation that is an infestation in our land, on our land for more than half a century? This is despite the fact that the UN has adopted hundreds of resolutions that call for the end of this settler, racist occupation that's very much like the apartheid. Do we need more commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, committees of the wise, and quartets to be convinced that this Israeli occupation is quite grave? The UN undergoes a true test, and if we want to maintain what is left of its credibility, some countries need to seize the policies of hypocrisy, double standards, and trafficking in the interests of their people. Member states need to use actions, not just words, through practical measures that force Israel to implement relevant UN resolutions, so that we would see an end to this settler occupation and the unprecedented tragedy of Arab citizens that suffer for decades, have been suffering for decades under occupation in the Syrian Golan and other occupied Arab territories. Mr. President, some of us must not deceive themselves and the world by continuing to provide pretexts and justifications for the Israeli policies. Everyone is very much aware of the fact that successive Israeli governments has never been concerned about peace. They have been very anxious to continue occupation, settlement, and aggression. They have occupied and annexed the Syrian Golan and Jerusalem, the Palestinian Jerusalem. They have committed aggressions and crimes, crimes of war and against humanity, and they have killed envoys of the UN and peacekeepers in Ghana, and it has committed aggression against Islamic and Christian religious sites, and it tries to impose now the Jewish nature of the state. And the current Prime Minister clearly says that he refuses the two-state solution. And in the past, the former Prime Minister Shamir said in a statement in 1991 on the margins of the Madrid Peace Conference that the Israeli delegation has instructions to negotiate for 10 years just for the sake of negotiation. And it is surprising that in this council there are those who deny Palestinians the simplest of their basic rights, including the right to establish their state over their national land, and identifying a deadline for the end of Israeli occupation. Those continue to support Israel at the economic, diplomatic, and political levels. They continue to guarantee Israel's military superiority and its acquisition of nuclear weapons, in addition to shielding Israel of any accountability. Mr. President, Israel continues to occupy Syrian Golan since 1967. It imposes on Syrian citizens in the Golan a bitter reality that has to end by all means that are guaranteed by international law. Hence, the UN must shoulder its responsibility to deal with this reality seriously and with much interest in implementation of relevant resolutions, particularly Security Council Resolution 497 of 1981. Israel must end its systematic and grave violations of human rights. There should be an end to the policy of settlement, terrorism, suppression, racial discrimination, and stealing the natural resources of Julan, including water, oil, and gas, in addition to ending the policy of arbitrary arrest against Syrian citizens. In this regard, we urgently call upon the UN Secretary General and the Security Council to exert the necessary humanitarian efforts to force Israel to release all Syrian detainees, and most important of which, the Mandela of Syria, Sidqi al-Maqt, who has been arrested once again in February for any reason, not for any reason except the fact that he documented the relationship between the Israeli occupation forces to the terrorist groups in the area of separation in the Syrian Julan. He was imprisoned for 27 years in Israeli detention centers without any legal grounds, simply because he did adhere to his allegiance to Syria and he refused to carry an Israeli identity card. There is an international silence towards these Israeli practices. Israel has violated the agreement of the separation of forces of 1974. It also endangered the lives of UNRWA staff and undermined their mandate through supporting with Qatar terrorist groups in the area of separation, including Jabhat al-Nusra, that is Al-Qaeda linked, including providing these groups with all forms of logistical support, and they even treat the injured members of these groups in Israeli hospitals. Hence, we demand that this serious issue receive all seriousness and attention without delay. The Secretariat and the DPKO has been ignoring this, and there is no justification for overlooking this. Here, I'd like to point out that it is very clear to all of us that the misleading statements of some speakers only seek to create fictitious battlefields for the Security Council, to distract attention and to reduce pressure on Israel, and covering the fact that Israel refuses the two-state solution and the entirety of the peace process. I would like to say here to the representatives of the UK and the US, stop your hypocrisy and lies. If you fear for the situation of Palestinian refugees, then you should not be supporting Israel. That was the main reason why these refugees have been in ordeal since 1948. You are partners in the creation and the continuation of the ordeal of those refugees, and whether inside Syria or outside Syria. You have used the veto dozens of times to protect Israel's backsliding on the implementation of the right of return under Resolution 194 of the General Assembly. Syria has received those refugees, considering them brothers and sisters. We welcome them and we treated them with much generosity like we treat Syrians, and will continue to exert all efforts to protect them from the terrorism that is supported by the US, Israel, the UK, and other regional and Arab states until they return to their homeland in occupied Palestine. Finally, Mr. President, the representative of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia used shameful and unacceptable words to refer to my country. Hence, I would not tackle the political incitement that he used, and it is not based on information, but is based on ignorance. He has forgotten that this item on the agenda has to do with the Palestinian question, and he has been doing service to the government of Israel and its allies. Zionism and Saudi Arabia are the root of terrorism, fanaticism, and the culture of hatred in the world. It is the culture of ISIL. The culture of beheading is a culture from Jahili times, and it is Takfiri, Wahhabi, and it comes from Saudi Arabia. The policies of Saudi Arabia has instilled the seeds of sectarian sedition in the region, and they will pay the price for this mistake. As for the threats of the representative against my country and his claims that Saudi Arabia is ready to help the Syrian people, this only confirms that the rulers in his country have their hands red with Syrian blood, and that they are much involved in the funding, harboring, supporting Wahhabi terrorists that are mercenaries that come from all over the world, and Saudi Arabia sends them to Syria so that they would undermine the stability of Syria. Saudi Arabia continues to be a center for the culture of hatred and sectarianism. They are very much like Zionist Israel. If the ambassador of Saudi Arabia really has the authority to threaten my country as he just did, then I test him now before all of you. Show us what you can do against my country. Hence, we will cut any hand that tries to hurt Syria, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will receive the punishment it deserves.
أشكر مندوب الجمهورية.
I thank the representative of the Kingdom of Syria, and I now give the floor